On the 30th of September 2005, 10-year-old Robin Doan was fast asleep in her bed in the family house. She wasn't having a peaceful sleep. In fact, she was having a nightmare. And in this nightmare, there was gunshot after gunshot after gunshot. The nightmare was so scary that it woke Robin up. But chillingly, even though she was awake, Robin could still hear the gunshots going off. And then her mother's scream, another pop, and a final moan from her mother before there was silence. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes on YouTube and as a podcast version in the description box down below. The city of Pampa sits in Gray County in Texas, and back in the early 2000s, it had a population of almost 18,000 people. And in the middle of a remote plot of land there, sat a farmhouse that was home to wife and husband, 35-year-old Michelle Conrad and 31-year-old Brian. And between them, the two of them looked after Michelle's two children from a previous relationship, 14-year-old Zach and 10-year-old Robin. The four of them lived together, along with the family dog Molly, and Brian worked on their land as a farmer. Michelle and Brian had decided to have a child together. And so by September of 2005, Michelle was 6 months pregnant. On the morning of Thursday the 29th of September 2005, Brian had woken Robin up and made her a pancake breakfast, which was her favourite. And then she'd headed to school for the day. When she got back from school, her mum was at home, and the pair of them, they were really close, and so they just hung out for a few hours, with Michelle trying on her new maternity clothes, and the pair of them just having a really fun afternoon and evening. Everything really did seem completely normal. By the time the late evening came around, the entire family had settled into their beds as normal and gone to sleep. And Robin was, of course, the first to go to bed. She was the youngest there, and she'd fallen asleep and was dreaming when her dream began to turn into a nightmare. She heard gunshots and she woke up, but as she woke up, she quickly realised that those gunshots were not just part of her nightmare. She could still hear them. They were happening in real life. It was around 3:50 a.m. when Robin woke up, and at first she heard the gunshots, and then she heard her mum screaming. She heard more gunshots and then silence. And so Robin rushed out of bed and peeked out of her bedroom door, but at about that same time, she could hear footsteps making their way towards her bedroom. And so Robin jumped back into her bed and pulled the duvet over her and just pretended to be asleep. She was frozen. But the door opened, and suddenly there were two loud popping noises. The killer had actually aimed this gun straight at the 10-year-old girl asleep in her bed and shot twice. Thankfully, by some way of a miracle, those two gunshots had grazed the right side of Robin's body, and the shooter didn't know this at the time. Those bullets had continued on, leaving Robin lying in her bed, hurt, but by no means seriously injured. Robin knew at this point that the killer would have thought that she was dead, and so she did just that. She just pretended, she played dead. She lay as still as she possibly could, trying not to breathe audibly or move at all. But then she heard the killer's footsteps stop just outside of her brother Zach's room. She heard the light switch on, and then more gunshots, followed by a horrific sound, which she would later learn was the last sound that Zach made and his last breath. After that, the next thing Robin heard was some sort of rummaging around downstairs in the kitchen, almost as if this person, the intruder, was going through their kitchen cupboards. But we know now, from the investigation that followed, that nothing of note was stolen. And in fact, on the 911 call that Robin eventually makes, she says that she knows the lights are on in the kitchen, and so she thought perhaps the intruder was stealing food. After that, The house became silent, and she didn't know for sure that the killer had left, but she knew that she had to continue to pretend to play dead just in case he was still there. And she did that for 2.5 hours, desperately trying not to move. All the while, knowing that her brother has just been shot and killed. She'd also heard her mum screaming and then gunshots, so presumably she has been killed as well. And she knew that it was highly unlikely that her stepdad would still be alive. If he had been alive, he would have come and tried to find out if the other family members were okay. So she knew that likely her entire family was dead. After that 2.5 hours, Robin made her way downstairs. She grabbed the house phone, which was wireless, and then ran outside to make a 911 call to report this shootout at the house. And then, it is a truly heartbreaking 911 call. Robin says to the operator that she's scared a number of times before saying that she just wants her mum and that she's cold. And she repeats that she also cannot believe that this is happening. The emergency services arrived soon after that, and Robin ran out of the house and up to one of the officers who'd just pulled up. And that officer grabbed Robin, scooped her up, told her she was safe now and that they were going to take care of her. And then he put her in his patrol car and locked her inside. What he didn't say to Robin was that they actually had no clue whether or not the perpetrator was still in the house, and they needed to make sure that they had cleared that house before they started investigating the crime scene. And so as the team of officers approached the house, they could see immediately that one of the doors had been kicked in, and that was obviously how the killer had gotten inside. It was a forced entry situation. Now, as the investigating team or the officers made their way through the house, they found that Brian, Michelle, and Zach were all dead, and there were a number of bullet casings just scattered about. It also became clear pretty much immediately that the person who had done this was long gone, and so they needed to get to work on investigating exactly who had done this. One of the officers scouted the outside area of the house, and they were searching for anything that might identify any kind of a suspect. And that's when they looked down onto the kind of sandy dirt road, and they saw a number of footprints as well as tyre tracks. Now, they took a reference of those tyre tracks and they cross-checked them with the family vehicles, and when those results came back, it found that they weren't a match to any vehicles that the family owned. And so that became a potential piece of key evidence about identifying the perpetrator's car. Alongside this, they quickly ruled out that this was perhaps a burglary gone wrong, because on further inspection of the house, there really wasn't anything missing except for a few bits of food. And so what the motive was for this killing just was not clear. Robin was taken to a children's centre to have a full interview conducted, and she did recount the events of that night, although she did openly speak about what had happened, but she spoke about how hard this was and how she just didn't really want to go over it and go over certain details again and again. She comes across incredibly mature in this interview and obviously just absolutely devastated. At one point, the interviewer asks how many shots Robin heard, and she's very specific. Robin says 15, and she sticks to that. Robin was asked a number of times over the following few hours and days, and she always said 15. So the officers thought that it could be true that there were 15 shots, but of course they needed to confirm it. And if it was true, minus those 2 shots that had been aimed at Robin, that's 13 shots between the 3 remaining family members, which is truly, truly horrific. What they did discover after the autopsies were conducted was that Michelle was shot 6 times, Brian was shot 3 times, as was Zach, and then the final shot had actually killed Molly, the family dog. Those, along with the 2 shots towards Robin, confirmed that there had indeed been 15 shots. The investigation into these murders progressed actually quite slowly. There were no foreign fingerprints or significant DNA that they gathered from the house, and so they just didn't really have anything to go off of. They had no leads in terms of anyone who would have wanted to hurt the family or had any kind of a motive or grudge of any kind. We know from witness accounts that this family, Michelle, Brian and Zach, they were all really loved members of the community. They had no known enemies. There was no one else in their family or close friendship group that had any kind of a reason to want to cause them any harm. And so the investigation was really at a kind of dead end. But thankfully, this really wasn't for long because of something that happened over 500 miles away in Pineville, Missouri. There had been a tragic and brutal double murder just one day before the slaying of Robin's entire family. Orly McCall and his daughter-in-law, Dawn McCall, they were both found dead from gunshot wounds, and they were found in their home. It was quickly determined that their family car had been stolen, and so the investigating team started searching for that in hopes that it may lead them to the killer. The investigation into this double murder was well on its way, and on searching the house, the crime scene, they'd come across some very specific shell casings, and these shell casings were analysed, and they were appearing to be matching to a gun that had been stolen the night before. And that stolen gun had already been reported as that by the owner. And the gun owner, Scott King, knew exactly who had stolen it. Scott had reported his 23-year-old son, Levi, as having stolen a number of his guns from his house whilst he was away. And one of them that he'd reported as missing was a match to this very specific shell casing found at the McCall crime scene. Levi was well known to authorities. He had a criminal record, most notably for when he had burglarised a neighbour's house and then followed that by committing arson. And for this crime in particular, he received a 17-year sentence. Now, he didn't actually end up serving that entire sentence, though. Instead, he was moved to a halfway house in St. Louis, and that was after just a year and a half of him being behind bars. This spot where he was living was his last known official address. But as with a halfway house, you're sort of under lock and key. Like, people know where you're at and you're supposed to be there at all times. But Levi had actually escaped from this house. And in reality, he had hitchhiked over 700 miles going from St. Louis back to his hometown of Pineville. However, he actually had no intention of staying there. On arrival back at his family house, his dad Scott saw him and he was not happy to see him. The pair argued, and Levi said he felt angry, as though he wasn't good enough for his dad or his family, and that made him feel rejected. And this, he said later, is what set off this horrific chain of events that followed. After the argument with his dad, Levi waited for Scott to leave in the morning for work, and once he saw him drive off into the distance, Levi then went and broke into the house, and he just started vandalising it. He had particular focus on his dad's bedroom, but before he left, he decided he was also going to steal a number of guns. Levi was just leaving the street next to his dad's when he saw two people coming out of one of the houses, and Levi saw this as his opportunity. He broke in and he just started rummaging around looking for anything he could steal. He assumed that these two people he'd just seen leave would be out for a while, but at some point he heard a car pull up outside and realised that they had arrived back home. And so Levi hid in what he later learned was Orly's office, and he just waited there for the two people to enter. Dawn came in first and headed straight down into the living room. Levi just watched. But when Orly came in, Levi emerged from the office and locked eyes with him. The man in front of him didn't have time to respond before Levi started shooting. The house isn't huge, and any place nearby is going to have heard that gunshot. And so Dawn had stopped at the bottom of the stairs and she was just frozen. Clearly she couldn't believe that this was actually happening. And Levi could only see her left leg because she was hidden by this pillar. But Levi aimed and fired anyway. And he just kept on shooting until he was sure that she was dead. After that, he grabbed the set of car keys and left the home. Once he was in the car, that's when Levi said that he felt this utter sense of peace. He no longer felt angry. It wasn't long after that, though, that Levi was stopped at the border in El Paso. He actually wasn't trying to get back into the US. He had planned to escape to Mexico, and he had crossed the border successfully. But whilst he was driving around, he'd managed to get himself lost and somehow turned back up around and back at the border crossing. And so Levi was brought into police custody for questioning. Now, this was just hours after the murders of Michelle, Brian, and Zach, but at this point, there hadn't actually been any kind of a link made between the two sets of killings. During questioning, Levi was asked about the murders of the McCalls, and he pretty much admitted it straight away. And he went into excruciating detail, including specifically speaking about how he felt when he killed, and that this feeling he had was a better feeling than any drugs he'd ever tried. He felt as though everything stopped, and he finally felt as though he was content, in a kind of euphoric state, as he described it. It was like nothing he'd ever experienced before. He also went on to tell the officer questioning him about his childhood, which by no means was straightforward. He had lived with his 6 siblings, and he was brought up by a mum and dad who both had drug dependency, and so it wasn't wholly surprising that he, Levi, started drinking alcohol when he was a child. And soon after that, he also started taking drugs as well. The family didn't have much money, but there were 9 of them living in this house. And with the 2 parents not really looking after them, this led to a couple of the children being taken into care and being dealt with by social services. But Levi wasn't one of them. He was able to stay at the house. Levi was also diagnosed. Well, I've seen it reported, but I've not been able to find any official record in court documents. But he at least said that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Now, during Levi's childhood, a friend was over at the house, and Levi's dad, Scott, decided for some reason to give this child, or I think maybe teenager at this point, but to give them a gun. I don't know why he did it, but anyway, give a kid a gun, what's going to happen? Well, they're probably not going to really think about the gravitas of what this weapon could do. And that's exactly what happened. The friend was sort of messing about with the gun, not really taking it seriously, and it's reported that it accidentally went off, and a bullet flew into the air and ended up striking one of Levi's brother, who was just 13 at the time, and it killed him. So Levi was now dealing with having a really challenging home environment in terms of his mum and dad just being wholly irresponsible and neglectful. And now he was also having to deal with the grief of losing his brother to an event that his own dad had sort of accidentally helped happen. Meanwhile, back in the interrogation room, Levi was still talking. In fact, he specifically asked to speak to the deputy. He knew he was going down for this double murder, that was clear, but he wasn't done yet. Now, it's not exactly clear why, as in Levi's head, why he would do this, and he's never spoken on exactly why he said what he did, but he told the deputy that he had killed more people. He went on to say that they were in Pampa, Texas, and that there were 4 victims. Now, of course, at this point, he doesn't know that little Robin has survived. And so he went on to talk about exactly what he'd done, ultimately confirming a lot of what Robin had already told officers, with the difference, of course, him not knowing that there had been a sole survivor. When Levi was more specifically questioned about the killings, he spoke about how that first time he killed, it gave him this feeling of peace. And after that, he'd stolen the McCall's car and was sort of just driving down the street, and he got a certain distance away. When he started to feel that feeling of peacefulness was disappearing, it started to fade, and he said he knew that if he wanted that again, he was going to have to kill. And in an awful case of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, kind of. Michelle, Brian, Zach, and Robin were just in their home when Levi had happened to be driving past when he decided he needed to kill again. And so he pulled the car over up near their house, got out, and then managed to kick the door in and then started his killing spree. After arriving at the remote farmhouse, Levi kicked in the door, walked into the house, and saw a bedroom to his left. He continued further in and he saw two people lying in bed. They were awake now, of course, because of the shattering of the back door that they undoubtedly heard. And so Levi aimed his rifle at Michelle and shot her until he knew she was dead. And then he turned to face Brian and did the same. After he was sure that both of them were dead, he turned and walked upstairs to another bedroom. He'd even seen Robin from where he was standing when she was peeking through that bedroom door, and then he'd made her way towards her bedroom, opened up the door wider, and aimed to attempt to shoot her before finally finishing by killing Zach. The McCall murder case wasn't going to go to trial because Levi didn't want to get sentenced to death, and so he actually agreed to a plea deal. If he pleaded guilty to both Orly and Dawn's murder, then it was agreed that he would be sentenced to 2 life sentences and the death penalty would be off the table. However, when it came to the sentencing discussions for the murders of Michelle, Brian and Zach, officials wanted to talk to Robin and hear what she thought. And Robin was clear. She did want Levi to receive the death penalty. He'd taken away her entire family and he tried to take away her life too. And so the death penalty was certainly on the table in this case as far as she was concerned. By the time the trial came around, Robin was actually called to testify, and she was only 14 years old at the time, but she took the stand and spoke directly to Levi. Ultimately, however, Levi was sentenced to life again. As for Robin, she moved in with her dad and his wife just outside of Pampa, but her life wasn't only changed forever because of the brutal murders, but also because of what her school peers would think. Reading this and reading her account of sort of the aftermath is really, really troubling. This girl is a teenager at this point. Being a teenager is hard for most people, but add on this kind of extremely traumatic event, and it's no wonder that she made the decision to eventually stay out of school for those couple of months following the murder. But when she returned, however, she said she felt like a, quote, freak, adding that she thought if she acted as if nothing had happened, then she'd be better off. So she kind of didn't deal with this. And by the time she was in middle school, up until the age of about 13, Robin had moved away from her dad's and in fact was now living with an auntie who simply had a bit more time to take care of her, she decided, and her dad decided it would be best. Now, after the trial, she did build up a life for herself. She became a cheerleader at Pampa High School, and she also played on the basketball team. And the community really rallied around Robin. Many of them had known the family. Many of them had been watching from the sidelines as Robin's life continued on, and they'd been watching closely, taking care of her in an obvious way sometimes, or for others it was just looking out for her from afar. By the time she graduated high school in 2013, a group of officers and deputies who knew Robin from when they came to her side at the murder scene back in 2005, many of them had clubbed together and they managed to raise $10,000 to help pay for her to go to junior college. This case is truly horrific, but I think what it shows you by the end is just how much that community supported Robin and were there for her. And she has gone on to live quite an extraordinary life, and she's changed ideas about what she wants to do with her life, but often it is revolving around helping people. Her latest sort of venture is wanting to become involved with law and in lawyering and help other people. You might have seen that I did an interview recently with New York Times best-selling author Amy Tintera about her new book, Listen for the Lie. I read this and I bloody loved it. It is about a woman who gets contacted by this true crime podcaster who is covering this woman's best friend's murder. This book fulfilled all of my thriller, crime, fiction needs. And look, I'm never picking up a book for the comedy, but this book was well funny and has the best portrayal of a grandmother-granddaughter relationship that I have ever seen. I want to know this woman's gran. She's like mine, was kind, funny, and just like dryly sarcastic. So I'm giving away 10 copies of this book. This is open only to UK residents at this point because I'm paying postage myself, and it'd just be well expensive to post 10 books overseas. But I promise that I will do a giveaway that includes other countries, not just the UK. And I will do that when we hit 100,000 subscribers. So we're only 70k off, guys. It's going to happen. We are a little way off, but I definitely want to celebrate that when we get there. So I guess keep an eye out for that. For UK listeners, watchers, to be in it with a chance of winning this book, all you need to do is go to our Instagram, which I'll put in the description box. Click on the giveaway post, tag one friend who you think would enjoy this book, and that's it. I guess you can enter as many times as you like. Make sure you're following my Instagram at RedRumTrueCrime so that if you win, I can DM you and get your address and send it to you. DMs will come from that account and only that account. So not that anyone's going to be scamming you off of RedRum, but just in case. Other than that, I'll see you next week. Bye.